The sun beat down over the eastern Mediterranean, casting long shadows on clay brick walls and bustling market squares. In 1200 BC, civilization seemed to be humming with the confidence of kings. From Egypt to Mycenae, from Hittite to Ugarit, palace economies churned, merchants sailed heavily laden ships, and scribes scratched cuneiform records onto damp tablets. But beneath this golden glow, cracks were forming in the very bedrock of Bronze Age society. Across these great civilizations, inequality had grown like an old tree's roots, breaking the stone from within. In Mycenaean Greece, palatial centers dictated the flow of labor and resources, while commoners toiled without much security. Grain stores grew high in the granaries, but in some cities, hunger haunted the working classes. In Hittite, labor strikes broke out, not modern picket lines, but sharp refusals to serve unless rations were increased. Royal archives mention dissent, demands, discontent. These weren't isolated rumbles. They were signs of pressure building beneath the polished floor tiles of ancient wealth. Worse still, kings and elites grew ever more dependent on systems that couldn't bend without breaking. Bronze itself was the lifeblood of their economies, essential for weapons, tools, even status. But to make it, they needed tin, and tin didn't grow just anywhere. It had to be traded over long, risky routes, passing through the hands of merchants, middlemen, and sometimes enemies. The systems worked, until they didn't. And as food became harder to grow, people began to move. Refugees trickled into urban centers looking for work or bread. Local officials struggled to keep the peace. In the Levant, records from towns like Emma show concerns over rising grain prices, supply issues, and swelling populations. Sometimes, desperate measures followed: forced relocations, harsher laws, heavier taxes. That never ends well. The cities themselves, wonders of planning and architecture, became suffocating under their own complexity. Walls went up not just to keep enemies out, but to hold restive subjects in. Bureaucracies bloated with scribes and tax collectors who sometimes knew more about ledgers than leadership. Kings penned increasingly frantic letters to each other, asking for help, for reinforcements, for more grain. Few answers came. Even mighty Egypt, the eternal land of the Nile, was not immune. While Ramses III would later fight to preserve what was left, his predecessors were already grappling with workers striking over unpaid wages in Deir el-Medina, an ancient first in organized labor history. That wasn't just a sign of fiscal mismanagement, it meant trust in the system had begun to collapse. And then there were the whispers. Not just of unrest or hunger, but of omens. The gods seemed silent. Priests performed rites with increasing urgency, hoping to chase away what they could not understand. When people lose faith in their food, their leadership, and even their gods, history teaches us what comes next. In Hattusa, the Hittite capital, the vast archives preserved diplomatic letters with urgent tones, enemies at the borders, vassals growing bold, grain running low. And behind the political theater, nature added its own drama. Seasons were shifting. Rains didn't fall when they should. Harvests were unpredictable. Some years, the fields yielded dust. Like a great vase slowly tipping, the world swayed toward collapse, not from one blow, but from many small fractures that no one repaired in time. The elite couldn't see it. The common folk could feel it in their bones. And the worst was still to come. Trade was the glue that held the Bronze Age world together, but even the strongest glue weakens when stretched too thin. For centuries, vast networks crisscrossed the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, and lapis lazuli from the Far East. Cities like Ugarit, Byblos, and Troy didn't just survive on these networks, they thrived because of them. But when trade falters, everything connected to it begins to fray. Picture a merchant ship, its hull groaning under the weight of bronze ingots and amphorae of wine, sailing from Canaan to the Aegean. These vessels weren't just moving goods, they were moving lifelines. Palaces depended on foreign materials to arm their soldiers, clothe their nobles, and even perform their religious rituals. The disappearance of just one link in the chain could send ripples through the entire system. And that's exactly what started to happen. The collapse didn't come all at once. It began as subtle disruptions, missed shipments, delayed arrivals, merchants who didn't return. Storms, piracy, and local conflicts made voyages riskier. When cities like Ugarit began receiving fewer ships from Egypt, fewer carts from inland Anatolia, they scrambled to fill the gaps. But in an economy built on precise balances, improvisation wasn't always possible. One famous letter, discovered in the ruins of Ugarit, paints a picture of panic. A merchant pleads for urgent delivery of grain and troops because enemy ships were seen offshore, and supplies were running out. The desperation in the text suggests this wasn't just a temporary hiccup. The networks that once carried abundance had thinned to mere threads. The tin trade in particular was a fragile artery. Without tin, bronze could not be made. With less bronze, armies shrank, tools dulled, and repairs went unfinished. Cities that relied on imports to forge weapons suddenly found themselves vulnerable, right when threats were multiplying. Worse, no one could control all the routes. Tin might start in Central Asia, but it had to pass through the hands of dozens before reaching the palaces of Mycenae or the forges of Hattusa. Every disruption added a delay. Every delay added danger. Some cities tried to hoard what resources they had left, but that only worsened the problem. When Egypt prioritized supplies for its elite, poorer regions suffered famine. When Mycenaean kings tightened their grip, the working class rebelled. As trust in trade dissolved, so too did diplomatic ties. Allies became rivals, and cooperation gave way to hoarding and suspicion. The economic collapse wasn't just about material goods, it was about trust. Trust that caravans would come, that ships would dock, that prices would hold. When a palace could no longer promise those things, it lost its authority. Kings looked less like gods and more like gamblers who'd lost the game. And what do people do when the trade routes die and the cities can no longer feed them? They move. Nomads became more desperate. Banditry increased along once safe roads. Populations that once depended on the flow of goods turned inward, abandoning coastal ports for more defensible inland locations. It was a kind of slow retreat, not from an enemy, but from a way of life. And while one city's fall might be absorbed, the world of the Bronze Age had become so interdependent that collapse in one region sparked collapse in others. When Ugarit burned, it wasn't just a local tragedy, it meant other cities lost a key trading partner. When the Hittite Empire shrank, the balance of power shifted, destabilizing its neighbors. The system wasn't just interconnected, it was fragile. So when the ships stopped sailing and the goods stopped arriving, the collapse didn't have to shout. It whispered, like sails no longer catching wind. The waves rolled in, as they always had, but this time, they carried something different. Not spices or tribute or fleets of trusted traders. They carried destruction. Sometime around 1200 BC, unknown raiders emerged from the sea with a force that stunned even the most fortified of coastal cities. They didn't come for treaties. They came to burn. Today, we call them the Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation of seafaring warriors whose origins remain debated, but whose impact is undeniable. The Egyptians depicted them in chaotic battle scenes, their ships bearing unfamiliar designs, their soldiers clad in odd feathered helmets. They struck fast, unpredictably, and seemingly everywhere. From the Levant to the Aegean, cities that had stood for centuries suddenly fell silent. One of the first to go was Ugarit, a jewel of the coast and a key hub in the international trade web. The city had been sending letters to allies begging for aid, but no help came. The final missive, found centuries later in the charred remains of a royal archive, ends abruptly. Scholars believe the attack came before the message could even be delivered. The Sea Peoples didn't conquer and rule in the way traditional empires did. They raised. They displaced. They caused systems to collapse by their very presence. In Anatolia, they struck at key ports, severing the Hittite Empire's connection to the sea. In Canaan, they overran towns, forcing survivors inland or into hiding. In Cyprus, archaeological layers show widespread destruction, settlements reduced to ash, population centers abandoned. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III fought back with all the might of a kingdom already buckling under internal pressures. In the famous Battle of the Delta, he claimed victory, capturing sea people's ships and nets, turning their invasion into a bloodbath. But even victory had a cost. The resources spent defending Egypt were enormous. The strain further weakened the empire's core. Ramses might have saved his borders, but he couldn't save the world they once shared. Who were these sea peoples? Theories abound: displaced Mycenaeans fleeing famine or war, raiders from Sicily or Sardinia, even rebellious mercenaries once hired by the very empires they now plundered. Their names, Shurden, Shikalesh, Peleset, appear on temple walls but not in shared histories. We know them mostly by the chaos they left behind. But what's more telling is the way their attacks revealed just how brittle these once mighty civilizations had become. Cities that should have withstood siege fell within days or weeks. Rulers who once commanded tribute from afar now begged for assistance. The sea peoples didn't just arrive, they exposed how the great bronze world had lost its resilience. In the wake of their attacks, entire regions transformed. Refugees fled inland, taking with them only what they could carry. Former port cities lay in ruins, their harbors filled with debris, their temples scorched. The social order unraveled. Elite families disappeared from the record. Administrations collapsed. Writing ceased. The sea peoples didn't light the match that burned the Bronze Age, but they did fan the flames. By the time the storm passed, the landscape had changed. Power had shifted. And though the sea peoples themselves vanished from history, the vacuum they left behind reshaped the course of human civilization. The seas calmed again. But the world they lapped against was no longer the same. The earth itself seemed to join the rebellion. As empires cracked and cities burned, the forces of nature stirred with eerie synchronicity, adding terror to a world already teetering. What trade routes and raiders began, climate and catastrophe finished. The signs were everywhere, if you knew where to look. In the Levant, once green valleys turned brittle, and crops withered before harvest. Tree rings from ancient oaks in Anatolia revealed years of stunted growth, evidence of prolonged drought. Even the Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, began to falter. Its annual floods, once predictable as the stars, grew irregular, failing to nourish the farmlands that had fed millions for millennia. Food shortages became famine. In cities across the eastern Mediterranean, storage silos emptied faster than they filled. Desperate letters discovered on clay tablets pleaded for grain shipments that never came. One Hittite envoy begged a neighboring kingdom for even a few measures of barley to stave off starvation. Another record from Emmer details mass relocations, families leaving the countryside in droves, abandoning their fields in search of sustenance or safety. But famine didn't travel alone. Earthquakes rumbled through the Aegean and Anatolia, toppling palaces that had stood for centuries. Knossos, the legendary center of Minoan power, showed signs of seismic destruction, layers of rubble that matched known fault lines. In Troy, a layer of debris points not just to war, but to walls shaken loose by tremors. Imagine it, a society already stretched to its limits by political unrest and economic strain, suddenly struck by a quake that destroys the food stores, buckles the city gates, and leaves its temples in ruins. It's not just the buildings that collapse, it's the belief that the gods are watching over you. Religious faith, once a pillar of Bronze Age stability, was shaken. Priests and rulers had long claimed divine favor, using rituals and offerings to maintain cosmic order. But when the rains failed and the ground split open, the people began to doubt. They turned to new deities, new prophets, or simply turned away. In Egypt, tomb art grew darker, more chaotic, reflecting a world that felt increasingly unstable. And still the climate worsened. Studies of ancient pollen trapped in lakebeds show dramatic shifts in vegetation during this period. Forests gave way to scrublands. Arable land shrank. Herding routes dried up. Nomadic groups, driven by hunger, began moving into settled territories, not always peacefully. Farmers couldn't farm. Herders couldn't herd. The land had betrayed them, and so they betrayed one another. In Greece, the collapse of Mycenaean centers like Pylos and Thebes may have been hastened by a combination of drought and fire. Archaeological layers there are blackened, full of ash and collapsed timbers. And after the fires? Silence. No signs of rebuilding, no new palaces. Just abandonment. Environmental collapse doesn't make headlines in stone. It whispers through soil layers, charcoal traces, the sudden absence of olive pits and barley seeds in excavation sites. But its effects are loud: hunger, migration, war. Entire populations on the move, carrying memories of lost cities and scorched fields. It was a perfect storm, literally. Systems already destabilized by trade failure and war now faced nature's fury. No single disaster would have been fatal. But stacked one atop the other, they became lethal. And while the raiders may have come and gone, drought and famine lingered. The world wasn't just collapsing, it was drying out, burning down, and being buried in its own ash. By the end of the 12th century BC, the climate had taken what the sword and sea had started. And in its wake, something irreversible took root: the end of the known order. In the quiet that followed the chaos, something even more chilling happened. Civilization forgot how to speak. Not in voice, but in writing. In the centuries that followed the Bronze Age collapse, the great written traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean dimmed and, in many places, disappeared entirely. Before the fall, cities like Ugarit, Mycenae, and Hattusa were humming with scribes. These weren't mere note-takers. They were the memory keepers of the age, trained in complex systems of cuneiform, linear B, hieroglyphs, and other scripts. They recorded everything, from royal decrees and merchant accounts to spells, myths, and treaties. They were the hard drives of the ancient world, and their disappearance was no small matter. At Ugarit, archaeologists uncovered entire libraries of clay tablets preserved by fire, their Akkadian and Ugaritic inscriptions frozen in the moment of destruction. These were not just records, they were evidence of a deeply literate society, one that could coordinate international diplomacy and track harvest cycles with astonishing precision. But after the collapse, the scribes were gone. In the Aegean, Linear B, a script used by the Mycenaeans to manage palace economies, vanished. Not evolved, not transformed. Vanished. No Greek writing would emerge again for over 400 years. That's not a pause, it's a blackout. Historians call it a dark age, and it earned the name. In Anatolia, the Hittite archives at Hattusa stopped growing. The final tablets speak of famine, unrest, and ominous dreams. And then, nothing. No more chronicles. No more royal edicts. The great stone gates of the city still stood, but they guarded silence. This loss wasn't just about politics or war. It was cultural amnesia. Stories weren't copied. Laws weren't written down. Medicine, math, astronomy, all were scattered or lost. What remained was passed down orally, vulnerable to erosion, distortion, or complete disappearance. Temples were left unstaffed. Libraries became tombs. In some places, even the skill to read older texts was forgotten. The knowledge that once leapt from tablet to tablet now slept beneath the earth. And what happens when a civilization forgets its own past? It starts over. In Egypt, hieroglyphs endured, but their complexity grew decadent, disconnected from the simpler scripts used for administration. In the Levant, scribes who once mastered Akkadian were now relying on local alphabets, simpler, and easier to teach. Ironically, it's from this simplification that the seeds of the modern alphabet were sown. Phoenician script, born in the ruins, would one day give rise to Greek, Latin, and beyond. From the silence, something new was forming. Still, the human cost was immeasurable. Cities once bursting with art and literature became ghost towns. Statues crumbled, murals faded, and the songs of old kings were replaced with folk tales and half-remembered myths. It's not that all memory was lost. In remote corners, some fragments survived. A stone carving here, a tablet there. But these were echoes, pale and distant. Like someone waking from a dream and struggling to piece together what it meant. The world had changed, and with it, the ability to record that change. The Bronze Age collapse didn't just end a political era. It erased the handwriting of an entire chapter of human history. And when future generations looked back, they didn't find scrolls or monuments. They found silence. A silence that would last centuries. Out of the wreckage, a new world began to stir. It was quieter, rougher, and far less ornate than what came before, but it was also more resilient. As the smoke cleared over the collapsed palaces and the scribes' styluses lay buried in ash, a different material began to take center stage: iron. Iron wasn't new. People had known of it for centuries, mostly in the form of rare meteorite iron or early smelting experiments. But it had never replaced bronze, until now. The infrastructure that had supported bronze was gone. The long-distance tin trade shattered, copper sources compromised, the craftsmen scattered. Yet iron could be sourced more locally, even if it was harder to work with at first. Necessity, as ever, became the mother of invention. And so, in villages rising on the bones of ancient cities, blacksmiths began experimenting. They heated, hammered, and quenched, learning by trial what had once been passed down in scrolls. Slowly, tools improved. Weapons sharpened. Iron became not just a substitute, but the future. The Iron Age had begun, not with a bang, but with a grind. New powers took shape, often smaller and more nimble than the great empires they replaced. In Greece, where the Mycenaean palaces had fallen into ruin, independent city-states like Athens and Sparta would one day emerge. These were not built on the old palace economies but on different models, some democratic, some militaristic, but all forged through a long period of recovery and reinvention. In the Levant, the Phoenicians rose from the ashes of Canaanite cities. Masters of the sea, they carried their alphabet far and wide, helping to lay the foundations for modern writing systems. They were not empire builders in the old sense. They were traders, navigators, adapters. Survivors. Further east, the Israelites emerged as a distinct cultural group during this period, carving out a space in the highlands once ruled by Canaanite kings. Their oral traditions, eventually written down, would come to shape three of the world's major religions. And Egypt, oh Egypt! Though weakened, it endured longer than most. The pharaohs of the new kingdom gave way to the Libyans, then Nubians, then Assyrians. Egypt became a survivor state, its grandeur dimmed but not extinguished. It would never again dominate the region, but it remained a cultural touchstone, a keeper of old knowledge in a world hungry for new beginnings. What's remarkable isn't just that something new came after the collapse, it's that so much of it was born from what had been lost. When the old structures fell, they left gaps for others to fill. New languages, new tools, new religions. Even myths were reborn. The fall of Troy, remembered through Homer's epics, carried echoes of real cities consumed by fire and fear. The gods changed, but they still spoke of storms, of battles, of the rise and fall of men. And across the region, oral stories filled the void once held by tablets and scrolls. Some of those stories were later written down, others passed through generations like family heirlooms. The past, though broken, was never completely gone. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just a dark ending. It was also a strange, painful rebirth. A time when the old world died, not in one great moment, but over decades of decline, disaster, and reinvention. And in its place, the seeds of the modern age took root. From the bones of palaces rose city-states. From forgotten scripts, new alphabets. From shattered empires, the idea of the individual community, of local power and human resilience. The sun set on the bronze kings. But it would rise again, on blacksmiths and poets, on farmers and traders, on dreamers who carried forward the ember of civilization. It was not the end. It was the beginning of the world as we now know it.